On a quiet autumn evening in 2016, the small town of Maplewood, Ohio looked exactly the way it always did: peaceful, predictable, and uneventful. The town had barely 10,000 residents, and most people knew each other by name, the kind of place where the biggest news was usually a high school football game or a new diner opening on Main Street. But that night, something happened that would change Maplewood forever, and it started with a phone call. At 9:42 p.m., the Maplewood Police Department received a 911 call from a man who sounded terrified. His voice was shaking, almost whispering, "Please, I think someone's inside my house." The dispatcher asked for his name. "Evan Carter," the man replied. He lived at 118 Willow Creek Road, a quiet street near the edge of town. The dispatcher tried to keep him calm while two patrol cars were sent to the address. "Sir, are you alone?" she asked. "Yes," Evan said. I think, I think someone's been watching me." 7 minutes later, the police arrived. The lights in the house were on. Evan's car was parked in the driveway. Everything looked normal. They knocked on the door. No answer. They rang the doorbell again. Still nothing. One of the officers tried the door handle. It was unlocked. When they stepped inside, they immediately felt something was wrong. The living room was quiet, the television still glowing with a paused movie. A cup of coffee sat on the table, still warm. But Evan Carter was nowhere to be seen. The officers slowly walked through the house, calling his name. When they reached the kitchen, one of them suddenly froze. Evan Carter was lying on the floor. He had been stabbed once in the chest, and he was already dead. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. His wallet was still in his pocket. It didn't look like a robbery. It looked personal. Detectives were called in immediately. The lead investigator was Detective Laura Bennett, a veteran officer who had spent nearly 15 years solving cases in the region. Maplewood rarely had violent crime, but Laura had worked in larger cities before transferring to the quiet town. She knew something about this scene felt strange. The first thing she noticed was Evan's phone lying on the counter. She picked it up and checked the recent calls. The last call was to 911, the one that brought officers here. But there was something else. Right before that call, Evan had received a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "You shouldn't have come back." Laura frowned. Come back from where? Evan Carter had moved to Maplewood only 6 months earlier. According to neighbors, he kept mostly to himself. He worked remotely as a financial analyst and rarely went out. No enemies, no known conflicts, just a quiet man living alone. Laura asked the officers to search the house carefully. Upstairs, everything looked normal: clothes in the closet, a laptop on the desk, books neatly arranged on shelves. But when one officer opened the bedroom closet, he noticed something odd. There was a small locked safe hidden behind a row of jackets. Laura had it opened. Inside, they found several documents: old newspaper clippings, photos, and a driver's license. But the name on the license wasn't Evan Carter. It said Michael Donovan. The photo was clearly the same man. Laura felt a chill run through her. Why would a man be living under a false identity? She began digging deeper into Evan's past, or rather, Michael Donovan's past. What she discovered was disturbing. 10 years earlier, a man named Michael Donovan had been involved in a major financial scandal in Chicago. He had worked as an accountant for a large investment firm. The company collapsed after millions of dollars disappeared from its accounts. Several executives were arrested, but Michael Donovan vanished before investigators could question him. He disappeared without a trace until now. Laura leaned back in her chair. If Evan Carter was really Michael Donovan, that meant someone might have been looking for him for a very long time. Maybe someone who wanted revenge. The next step was obvious. They needed to find out who sent the message. Detectives traced the phone number that texted Evan. It belonged to a prepaid phone purchased just 2 days earlier at a convenience store 20 miles away. But security cameras at the store had recorded the buyer, a tall man wearing a baseball cap. When Laura saw the footage, something about the man seemed familiar. She couldn't place it at first. But later that night, as she reviewed the evidence again, it suddenly clicked. The man in the video looked exactly like someone she had met earlier that day, Evan Carter's neighbor. His name was Thomas Reed, a friendly, middle-aged man who lived in the house next door. Laura drove back to Willow Creek Road immediately. The house next door was dark, but Thomas's car was in the driveway. Laura knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time.
Still nothing. She tried the door handle. Locked. Laura walked around to the backyard. A light was on inside the kitchen, and through the window she saw Thomas Reed sitting at the table. He wasn't moving. Laura called for backup and forced the door open. Inside, the smell hit her instantly. Blood. Thomas Reed was slumped over the table, dead. There was a single gunshot wound to his head. Next to him was a pistol. At first glance, it looked like suicide, but Laura noticed something strange. Thomas's hand was resting on the table, not holding the gun. Someone had placed the weapon beside him. This wasn't suicide. This was another murder. On the table, there was a single sheet of paper. Laura picked it up. It was a printed photograph of Evan Carter, or Michael Donovan, and written across the photo in red ink were the words, "One down." Laura felt a knot form in her stomach. If someone wrote "one down," that meant there were more targets. She began reviewing the old financial scandal again. The missing millions had belonged to several investors. 4 people in total had been responsible for the fraud. 3 had gone to prison. 1 disappeared, Michael Donovan. But now Laura realized something chilling. Those 3 men had recently been released from prison. One of them had died in a car accident 2 months earlier. Another had been found dead in his apartment just 3 weeks ago. Both deaths had been ruled accidents. Laura suddenly understood. Someone had been hunting them. One by one. Michael Donovan was just the latest victim. And the killer wasn't finished, because there was still 1 more man left. Laura checked the file. The last name on the list was Richard Hale, a former investment executive who now lived in Arizona. She immediately called the local police department there and warned them. But the officer on the phone said something that made Laura's blood run cold. They already knew about Richard Hale, because 2 hours earlier, officers had found him dead in his home, shot in the chest, just like the others. 4 men, all connected to the same crime, all dead within 3 months. But the strangest part of all, none of the security cameras near Richard Hale's house had recorded the killer. No witnesses, no fingerprints, nothing. It was as if the murderer simply appeared and vanished. Weeks passed. The investigation continued, but the killer was never found. Then one evening, Laura received a package at the police station. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed 4 men standing outside a courthouse 10 years earlier. Michael Donovan, Richard Hale, and the other 2 executives. But someone else was standing in the background. A young woman. Laura flipped the photo over. Written on the back were 4 words. Justice takes time. Laura searched the old case files again. Finally, she found the woman's identity. Her name was Sarah Collins. 10 years earlier, her father had been one of the investors who lost everything when the company collapsed. He had committed suicide shortly after. Sarah Collins disappeared from public records soon after the trial. Laura realized the truth too late. Sarah hadn't disappeared. She had been planning, waiting, for 10 years. And when the men responsible finally walked free, she hunted them down, one by one. The case was eventually closed, officially unsolved. But Detective Laura Bennett always knew what really happened. And somewhere out there, Sarah Collins was still free, living a quiet life, just like the men she had once hunted.